Hello again. Thank you for watching. My name is Cole Blair. I'm the lead biologist for Wildlife Preservation Canada's Native Pollinator Initiative. And this is the final installment of a series of videos all about bumblebees and what we do with them at Wildlife Preservation Canada, um, our work with them, why they're so important. And this installment is specifically on species ID. So just to preface, I'll be focusing individual species ID on the bees that are found in South Central Ontario. But even if you're not located in the same region, you can still use the same methods of ID to identify species in your area. So, how do we tell bumblebees apart? Um, just to recap, bumblebees are pretty easy to identify by color pattern, specifically the color patterns that are shown on the head, the thorax, which is that middle part of the body that has the wings and legs attached, and then the abdomen, which is that long part of the body where the stinger is at the bottom of, which is basically the bee's bum. So we can identify bees pretty easily by the different color patterns on these three parts of their bodies. And with the right angles, we can identify them from photos, which is what we were discussing in previous videos about Bumblebee Watch. Um, but with this video specifically about ID, we're just focusing on the different traits of the bee. Some bees can also differ from each other, not just in appearance, but also in their phenology, meaning their seasonalities. So this is true both in species. So some species have a longer active period than others. For example, the common eastern bumblebee is a good example of a species that emerges very, very early in the spring, and is also active all the way through to the fall. Whereas other species like the northern amber or the brown-belted bumblebee typically don't see those in this area, at least until a little bit later in the season. Not only is phenology used to help with species differences, but also used in caste differences. So bumblebees, again, being social, they are organized into different castes, with queens being the queen of the colony, and then workers and males all working towards the common interest of the colony. Queens, if we think back to the prior video on basic bee ecology, where we went over the bumblebee's colony cycle, we know that queen bumblebees are um, are what we'll find in the early spring, and they'll reemerge in the fall, the late summer and into the fall, when the colonies start to produce gynes, which are again the new queens. The workers will be more abundant in the late spring and throughout the summer, and males won't be present until the summertime and into the fall. So depending on um, what time of season it is, it can help you infer what caste or sex of bee this might be. So again, bees broadly can be identified by species, by the different color patterns um, on the head, thorax, and abdomen. Um, there are some differences between workers and queens that we'll get into. Males and females can get tricky in differentiating. Males make it pretty difficult, and we'll go over that. But just to recap, again, the features needed to identify your bumblebees are going to be the color bands on the abdomen, the thorax color, and the pattern. So again, this species, we see this band between the wings and the black hairs there coming down to the bottom of the thorax. That is a distinct pattern associated with this species, as is the pattern on the abdomen. And then also, for added detail, we can look at the color and shape of the face in order to parse through different different species that might look alike. Okay, before we get into actual species ID, I want to start with diagrams. So when we're looking at different Bumblebee ID resources, what you might look at are WPC's Bumblebee ID cards, which uses these diagram styles here. And this style of diagram is also what's used in Bumblebee Watch for their ID guides. And it's generally what we're looking at here when we're looking at these diagrams, the black parts, like we see on the top of the head here, that black blotch, that semicircle there, that's indicating black hairs. Similarly, where you see yellow is indicating yellow hairs, where you're seeing this kind of stenciled pattern that's indicating like a diffusion of yellow and black hairs. So there might be black hairs mixed in with the yellow hairs. Um, and then again, um, black hairs along the abdomen down here indicating, sorry, black uh, bands here down the abdomen indicating um, black hairs. And in these diagrams here, we also see the abdomen being divided into these six segments, which will come into play more when we're talking about males versus females. So with these dividing segments here, you can actually count how many segments there are and what colors they are. So we see T1's yellow, and then T's 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are all black. The diagrams in the center here are what's used in a ID guides that we use for added details. But again, you're still um, getting a good amount of benefit from just using the ID cards. They're easy enough to use, but the middle diagrams here that we're seeing are associated with, I'll just put it in front of the camera here, Bumblebees of North America, which is a more detailed ID guide. Um, However, again, the ID cards in the Bumblebee Watch field guide are enough to get through most of them. And I'll describe how I would go about comparing a diagram to a photograph. So on this right side here, I have a photograph. Um, and much like I see in the diagram, it's hard to see the front of the face, so I can't really see what hairs are on the face, but I at least see yellow hairs on the top of the head. I see yellow hairs all around the thorax, except for this little keyhole shaped pattern between the wings. And then I see the first abdominal segment is yellow, and all the abdominal segments after that are all black. So with that in mind, I would identify this photograph as Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee, because of the similarities with the diagram that we see here. Some added points here in this photograph, we see that there's pollen packed into this bee's hind leg. That's indicating a pollen basket. And I know that only female bees can carry pollen. And so I know not only is this a common eastern, I know it's a common eastern female. So I'll go through another one here. Again, these are some diagrams, and I'll practice again. So right off the bat, I see a yellow thorax with a black band between the wings. The abdomen, I see T1 and T2 is yellow, T3 is black, and then T4 and 5 are orange, followed by T6 being black again. And that, again, T6 is the stinger, so it's always going to be black. Again, we see on the abdomen two yellow bands separated by a black band, followed by two orange bands. And on the face, the diagram here shows us that we have black hairs on the top of the face and yellow hairs on top of the head. And so I've got a few possible photographs that might match to this diagram, and I'll go through each of them. A, we see similarly, we have the eye shape between the wings. However, we see that T2 is only partly yellow. Yes, T1 is yellow, which is a similarity to the diagram. T2 has this crescent of yellow that has orange on the bottom of it. So T2 starts yellow and kind of bleeds into orange, and then turns back to yellow again. Different from what we see in the diagram. It's missing that black band on T3, so it can't be species option A. Species option C, right off the bat, we see that the thorax pattern is significantly different. Yes, it's got that bands there, but again, this one here on C, that's the black hairs are coming down and touching the bottom of the thorax, giving it more of like a T shape or a thumbtack shape. So right off the bat, it's not matching the thorax pattern. But again, the abdomen, we're missing that band of black. We see the abdomen patterns do not match what's on the diagram. It's species B that's the right answer here. From this one angle, it's hard to see the entirety of the thorax pattern, but there does appear to be a band there. And then most notably, though, we see two bands of yellow and two bands of orange divided by that black band on T3. So just from that one trait on the abdomen, we can differentiate this species from these other two that have some similar traits. So this is again how I would go about comparing a photograph that I took or might have taken. So imagine I took these photographs or you took these photographs and you're looking at diagrams on Bumblebee Watch or on RID cards, and you're looking to compare and find a potential species match. That's the kind of logic that I would work myself through in order to um, match a photograph of a bee to the diagram of the bee that we have in our ID resources. Now, um, worker and queen bumblebees don't have a ton of differences. They differ in their phenology, so their seasonal periods, as I mentioned, queens being most common in the spring, while reemerging in the late summer, while workers being mostly abundant in the summer, and the queens being hidden away in the colonies while the workers go out and collect resources. For the most part, workers are just little mini-me versions of the queens, following similar color patterns, but just smaller in size. There can be slight differences, but by and large, workers are going to look like smaller queens. Where things get tricky is with males. So I will start this by prefacing that um, the ID resources and the diagrams that are provided, specifically with our ID cards and on Bumblebee Watch, they are representing female bees. Male bees can look strangely different. So again, not only are they out later in the season, but they have um, some common physical traits that differentiate them from female bees. And they also just have oftentimes different color patterns from their female counterparts of the same species. But here are the main um, physical differences and common traits between males that will differentiate them from females. So, by and large, regardless of species, male bumblebees are lankier. So, female bumblebees have 6 abdominal segments. Males have 7. So they have an extra abdominal segment, making their abdomens look extra long. And the same is said with their antenna. So um, female bees have, I believe, 12 antennal segments, while um, male bees have 13. And I don't expect anybody to go out and count antennal segments. But if you are lucky enough to have a male and a female side by side, you'll be able to tell right away that the male has a longer antenna. However, you can count the abdominal segments. And the abdominal segments are really the best indicator of a male bee from a female bee. And this is alluding to another subsection coming up on cuckoo bumblebees. Um, uh, but males have thinner legs because they don't carry pollen. However, there are some female bumblebees, being female cuckoo bumblebees, that also don't carry pollen and would also have thinner legs as a result. So if you just look at the legs, um, that might not be enough to tell you that it's a male. Really, the most concrete way to identify a male from a female bumblebee is by counting the abdominal segments. Some other characteristics include the overall hairiness of males. So males um, are pretty shaggy. They have longer hair, and oftentimes, depending on the species, most species have an abundance of yellow hairs on their face, giving them these little beards or mustaches. Some of species, the males can have enlarged eyes compared to their female counterparts, and this has to do with the different mating strategies of different bumblebees. So, um, this example on the bottom here, where with this bumblebee that has like really, really bulbous eyes, this is a species that engages in what's called perching, whereas other bees, the males don't have enlarged eyes, like the example above. That bee there looks like it's got normal sized eyes. Um, the species where the males have enlarged eyes, they engage in perching versus what other bee males might engage called patrolling. So a perching style of mating is where a bee might find a vantage point and then fly out to meet females as they fly by. And you would imagine that would require some really, really good eyesight. So, um, enlarged eyes are really just to help them find females. With patrolling, the male bees don't necessarily need that. They establish a flight path and they just fly that flight path over and over and over again and hopefully encounter a female. So, the difference in eyes, just an interesting aside, is tied to the bee's specific mating strategy. Another thing to remember about males too is that they don't have stingers, and this is also what I was alluding to back when I was teasing cuckoo bumblebees as a topic here. Um, let's say I look at a bee and I think, man, those are some really thin legs. This must be a male. And then I think, oh, I'm safe to handle it because it doesn't have a stinger. I didn't count the abdominal segments, and it actually turned out to be a cuckoo female. I would likely be stung. So again, it's not just a single trait that we're looking at to differentiate to tell a bee's sex or even a bee's species ID. We're looking at a combination of traits. Um, Most of the time, there'll be one that is more trustworthy than others. So with males, that would be the extra abdominal segment. And these photographs here are just to show you in diagram form. These are on our the backs of our RD cards and also on Bumblebee Watch. What the diagrams are illustrating when we see male abdomens and legs versus female abdomens, legs, and also the antennal segments. But this real life photo here, these are the same species. So these are both tricolored bumblebees. The one on the top is a female, the one on the bottom is a male. So this is a species where the male color patterns match very closely with the female color patterns. So the differences that are remaining are just going to be the basic differences of males compared to females, which again are seven abdominal segments compared to the six on a female. Um, the absence of the pollen basket and longer antenna, and it's just overall shaggier, longer hair. All right, and now we'll actually practice this. So I'll go through these with you viewers. Um, Ignore the unmute and chime in because it's just me talking to myself here. Um, I have a few bees here, and I'm just going to go through whether or not they're male and female and what makes them that. So we're identifying just from one single photo which of these are male or female and why. This first one here is a female. So we see, firstly, this mid part of their hind leg, we see that triangular shape there. That's indicating a pollen basket. We also see a stinger and six segments that we can count. So again, the first being yellow, second and third being orange, four being yellow, five and six being black. We can count six segments on the abdominal. Those segments are scientifically known as tergites or tergas. I've just been calling them segments, so that's why the extra word there, tergas, that's what that means. But again, if you were to look at this and look at that hind leg, that will tell you immediately that it's a female bee. Again, counting the abdominal segments will tell you that it's a female bee. This next one here is a male. We see the hind leg is quite thin. The antenna looks a little bit longer. This is a good comparison too, between what we just saw as a female compared to what we see here as a male. So um, alone, you might not be able to identify these antennae as being particularly long or longer than a female's. But now that they're side by side, hopefully you can see the female's antenna here. They're coming out pretty straight. Whereas the males, they've got that added segment. They're a little bit longer. They're starting to hoop down at the bottom. So just a good comparison representing the different antennal lengths. And also we can see that this male bee in the center has a longer abdomen. And you can even parse through and count the different segments. Similarly, this third bee here is another male for the same reasons. It's got a thin hind leg. It's got seven tergas, seven abdominal segments. Um, Also, you can see from the side view here that there's extra yellow on the face just for added confidence. But again, that hind leg and seven tergas really tells us that it is a male. These next ones here on the left here, this is a female. Again, we see the pollen basket. That wide, shiny hind leg is indicative of the pollen basket. You can count six segments again, with the bottom one being a stinger. The middle bee there's something present on this bee that will immediately tell you that it is a female, and that is pollen. So we see a big glob of pollen on this bee's midsection of their hind leg. And because we know that males can't carry pollen and female cuckoos can't carry pollen, but particularly because males can't carry pollen, we know that this is a female just because there's pollen. But we also see that there are six segments on the abdomen and a stinger at the bottom. But again, pollen being present in the legs, immediately you'll know that it is a female bumblebee. This last one on the right, um, you've probably caught on. It is a male. Hard to see the hind leg here, but it is thinner. Um, Again, hard to know if the antenna is particularly long without having a female comparison. But most importantly, we can count 7 abdominal segments on that very, very lanky abdomen. So we've gone over some male versus female traits of bumblebees. And now I want to actually get into how we would go about identifying things to species. And again, I'm using the bumblebees of South Central Ontario, as that is what I am most versed in, and that's where we're located. But the same um, logical through line and the same processes of comparison can be applied to different areas with different species of bees. What we like to do when we have a bee, a photograph of a bee or an actual bee that we're observing, we can start by placing the bee in broad color groups based on shared traits. So um, one color group is known as the black bottoms. The abdomen is simply the bottom part of it being black, as the name suggests. Yellow banded, as the name suggests, is just yellow bands on the abdomen with black on either side. Similarly, with the yellow grouping, it's just two species where the abdomen is mostly yellow. Um, Orange banded and orange bottoms, again, as the name implies, these are grouped um, by the shared trait of having two orange or red bands with yellow on either side, with the orange banded grouping, or with the orange bottom grouping having orange at the bottom of the abdomen. The cuckoo bees are grouped not for any particular color shared traits, like any shared traits in their color patterns, but they're grouped together simply because they are cuckoos that lack a corbicula. So um, they are grouped together by the absence of corbicula, the absence of the pollen basket, and by their social tendencies as parasites. So cuckoo bumblebees are social parasites. And again, the reason that they lack a pollen basket is because they don't actually go out and forage their own resources. Instead, they steal them from other bumblebee colonies. So they have host species. Cuckoo bumblebee females will infiltrate an existing colony and then basically use the colony's resources and worker force to raise her own reproductive females and males. The way I describe them makes them sound evil, but they're actually not. Having them present in bee communities, um, they pretty much serve the same role as a predator would um, in other trophic systems, um, in other habitats. Um, so you can basically think them along the lines of a predator. They're population regulators. And having them present in your communities is actually a good thing because it indicates to you that um, their host species are in good, healthy population standing in that community. So, for example, I've mentioned in previous installments the Ashton cuckoo bumblebee, very endangered, has not been seen in Ontario since 2008. Um, their host species include the rusty patched bumblebee, which is another critically endangered bumblebee, has not been observed in Canada since 2009. So, um, declines in the rusty patched also leads to declines in the Ashton cuckoo because they're a host species of the Ashton cuckoo. Similarly, on the flip side, the lemon cuckoo bumblebee, which is a very common cuckoo, its host species are also very common species, being like the two-spotted bumblebee being a common species. So, having the presence of different cuckoos in the bee communities can be indicative of a nice, healthy, diverse bumblebee community. So they're not evil. They're quite important. But I digress. So again, we're talking about lumping our bees into coarse color groupings based on shared traits. And then once we place them in those color groupings, we can look at the difference representatives in those color groupings and look for the nuanced differences in their color patterns and pick apart similarities um, and differences to help us finally reach a conclusive species ID. Well, there's one species in particular that can fit a multitude of these different coarse color groups. So all of these diagrams that I've circled in blue, confusingly, are all the same species. So they're all the same species. It's just this species can display a multitude of different color patterns. So depending on what color patterns are being exhibited by the individual bee, they might fall in the black bottoms, the yellow bandeds, the orange banded, or the orange bottomed, just depending on what the individual bee is showing. So I'll start with my individual species ID series with the black bottomed grouping. And I'll start with some species that show some similar traits. So on the top here, we have the rusty patch bumblebee. Um, this is specifically the worker caste. The workers have this namesake rusty patch on the second segment, T2, and that is going to be surrounded by yellow on T1 and then also yellow at the bottom of T2. Queens don't have this rusty patch, so for ID purposes, I'm focusing on worker for this species specifically. So again, it has that rusty patch on T2 surrounded by yellow on the top and bottom of that rusty patch. Contrast this with the brown-belted bumblebee, where we see similarly a brown patch on T2, but underneath that patch is black. There's no yellow on T2. It's just black all the way down to the bottom of the abdomen after that rusty patch, after that brown belt, that brown crescent. I should note that the rusty patch bumblebee, the thorax pattern also differs a little bit in that it's got more of a thumbtacky kind of T-shape pattern between the wings, whereas the brown belted bumblebee and even the two-spotted bumblebee here, they'll both have just a simple black spot between the wings on the thorax. But again, um, that brown crescent on the brown belted, having no yellow underneath it, can help you identify a brown belted from a rusty patched. Pretty every once in a while, somebody might photograph a brown belted thinking it's a rusty patch, simply for this reason that they're not aware that there needs to be that yellow at the bottom of T2 um, that would make it a rusty patch. And if it's absent, again, that would be a brown belted. Now we're thinking more so to this two-spotted bumblebee. Again, for its namesake, it has two spots of yellow on the second segment, kind of giving it that W shape. And now what's important here on T2, unlike the brown-belted bumblebee, where we see that brown crescent reach out and extend all the way to the edge of the abdomen, the two spots on the two-spotted bumblebee are going to be restricted to the center of the abdomen. So that yellow that forms the two spots will not be reaching out to the edge of the abdomen, as we would see with the brown-belted bumblebee's brown belt. We can also see that the two-spotted bumblebee has much longer hair than the brown-belted bumblebee, and that's the top of the head of the two-spotted bumblebee has yellow hairs compared to the brown-belted bumblebee that has black hairs. So again, we're looking at T2 as the most definitive trait between these three species. The rusty patched having that rusty patch surrounded by yellow on the top and bottom. The brown-belted having a brown crescent that extends out to the edges of the abdomen, followed by black down the rest of the abdomen. And then the two-spotted bumblebee, which has those two spots on T2 not extending out to the edge of the abdomen. And again, oops, my bad. The rusty patch is very unlikely to be seen as it has not been found in Canada since 2009. Some more black-bottomed representatives. We have the confusing bumblebee, the half-black bumblebee, and the common eastern bumblebee. And I'll start with the confusing. We see here that similar to the half-black, it's got T1 and T2 yellow. So the abdomen has two yellow bands followed by all black, so there's a similarity there. They're also quite long in their hair length, which is another similarity. However, um, the difference between these two bees in terms of color pattern has to do with the thorax. We see on the diagram, the confusing bumblebee actually does not have a thorax pattern. It's just all yellow hairs. It doesn't have any sort of spot between the wings. Now, you might be thinking, well, Cole, I'm looking at this first photo here, and the back of that thorax looks pretty dark. That first photo of the confusing bumblebee, the thorax looks pretty dark. I think there's a black spot there. I would say, um, be careful what you're looking at are hairs and not the exoskeleton. So, what do I mean by this? If we were looking at a half black bumblebee or a confusing bumblebee, um, look to the silhouette. Either look from the side view or look face on and look for the silhouette like we see in those middle photos and see if there's black hairs poking through. So although we see with the confusing bumblebee in that first photo, it looks pretty dark there between the wings, we see from the side view that there's actually not any black hairs poking up through those yellow hairs, as we see in the half black bumblebee. And this is because that dark spot that you might notice in that first photo of the confusing bumblebee is just the exoskeleton shining through from underneath those hairs. Again, we're looking at the colors of the hairs themselves. So if you look on the side view of a half black bumblebee, like we see in the middle photo and the far right photo, we see black hairs poking up through the yellow hairs. We do not see that on the confusing bumblebee, and that's because the confusing bumblebee has an entirely yellow thorax. The half black bumblebee, again, similarly, it has those two yellow bands on T1 and T2, but the thorax has a black spot between the wings, and you would be able to identify that black spot as black hairs, again, by looking from the side and seeing if there are hairs poking up that are black. The common eastern bumblebee is a pretty consistent and easy ID. It will always have this color pattern, no matter if it's a male, queen, or worker. It will always look like this, and very easily, it is the only species really that will have yellow on T1, followed by black all the way down to T6. And again, this is in the context of specifically the bumblebees of South Central Ontario. If you're elsewhere and you think, well, there's another species here that has uh, yellow only on T1, then um, my bad. This wouldn't be super applicable to your ecoregion. But again, you can use the same processes of identification to delineate species from lookalikes. Where we are in South Central Ontario, the common eastern bumblebee is going to be the only species that has yellow simply on T1, followed by black all the way down from T2 to T6. And again, it has that kind of keyhole stenciled pattern between the wings. But again, that abdomen is really the key giveaway here. Whereas all the other species that I mentioned here, the rusty patched, brown belted, two spotted, confusing, and half black, they all have some sort of pattern on T2. The common eastern lacks that entirely, and it's just black. It's also very, very, very common here in South Central Ontario. So you're very likely to bump into it. Moving on to our orange banded or our orange bottom bees, we have a few different representatives here, including the tricolored bumblebee, the black-tailed bumblebee, which is quite northern, unlikely to be found if you're in South Central Ontario. But if you're in more northern Ontario or northern in general, you might find it. And then also the red-belted bumblebee. So the tricolored bumblebee, we've seen a few different photographs of this throughout our little series here. The thorax, I should preface this again. Similar to the common eastern bumblebee, the tricolored bumblebee is very consistent in its color patterns. For the most part, it'll always show these color patterns. Workers follow the same thorax and abdomen patterns. Males follow the same thorax and abdomen pattern. So that abdomen pattern of T1 being yellow, T2 and 3 being orange, and then T4 being yellow, followed by 5 and 6 being black, that'll be consistent across casts for the tricolored bumblebee. Similarly, that thumbtack T-shaped pattern between the wings, that will also remain consistent. And if we contrast that to the black-tailed bumblebee, for example, again, It has similar bands between the wings, and it might drop down a little bit to give it a bit of a thumbtack, but we see in the tricolored bumblebee, it reaches down to the bottom of the thorax. In the black-tailed bumblebee, it doesn't really drop down that far. More importantly, though, again, is the abdomen here. Whereas in the black-tailed bumblebee, we see yellow is T1 is yellow, sorry, so that checks out, similar to the tricolored. T2 and 3 are orange, so that also checks out in relation to the tricolored bumblebee. But T4 here um, is often going to be an incomplete band of yellow. So it'll often be a fringe of yellow hairs at the bottom of T4 or a kind of reduced band of yellow at T4, whereas the tricolored bumblebee will always have a full band of yellow there. So that's where the difference is. That's where the key difference is. Some other differences we also see the black-tailed bumblebee is pretty hairy and shaggy, and also has a pretty high density of black hairs at the top part of the thorax, and that's what's being shown in this far right picture of the black-tailed bumblebee. It has a ton of black hairs, kind of giving it the stenciled appearance at the top of the thorax, where we have a lot of yellow and black hairs intermixed. The tricolored bumblebee will be a little bit different. Sometimes the workers can also have some black hairs um, at that same top part of the thorax, but not nearly to this extent. Um, Again, it'll be the abdomen that's the big differentiator between the tricolored and the black-tailed. And it'll also be the abdomen that's a big differentiator between the tricolored and the red-belted. So the red-belted is this highly variable um, species that I noted earlier. It's that one that I'd circled in blue. So this particular variant of red-belted is exhibiting its red morphology. Again, we see that bands between the wings, but it's not dropping down to a thumbtack that we would see in the tricolored or even the black-tailed sometimes. But it does have the bands between the wings similar to the black-tailed. We also see, like these other two species shown here, that it's got two bands of orange. However, the red-belted bumblebee will start off, their abdomen will be T1 being yellow. So again, that's common between these other two species we see here. But T2 starts off yellow. It's got a crescent of yellow that we don't see in these other two species. So in the tricolored bumblebee, every single band on the abdomen is a solid color. It's just one color. Um, Similar to the black-tailed bumblebee, specifically with the yellow and orange bands. With the red-belted bumblebee, T2 has two different colors on it, kind of like the rusty patch bumblebee. So T1 starts yellow, T2 starts yellow in a crescent form, and then kind of bleeds into an orange color to finish off T2. That bottom part of T2 is now orange. T3 is orange, and then T4 does the opposite, where it starts as orange and then bleeds back into yellow. So that would be the difference between a red-belted and these other two species that we see here on the screen based on color patterns alone. Again, we're looking to that abdomen to see that there is a crescent of yellow on T2 as opposed to a full band of yellow or a full band of orange or what have you. The presence of yellow on T2 at all would help you rule out the tricolored and the black-tailed altogether, because we would know that this species has only one solid color per abdominal band. I'll talk a little bit more about the red-belted bumblebee specifically. I did say it's quite variable. There are different combinations of color patterns for the red and black morphs, which makes this species quite difficult to ID. But again, some common characteristics is going to be the thorax pattern. Sometimes it can be a circle, a simple circle between the wings, a simple circle of black hairs. But commonly, it will be a band of black hairs, giving this eye shape. And again, in both of these examples here, we see a crescent of yellow on T2. So these two left-hand photos for the red morph and the black morph, they're pretty much identical, except that one is black where the other is orange or red. So similar color patterns on T1, T2, and then 4 and 5, except it's that T2 and 3 are different in that one of them will incorporate black and the other will incorporate orange. So just some things to be wary about when we're thinking about red-belted bumblebees in specific, as they can be highly variable in their exhibited color patterns. Briefly, are orange bottoms. Um, the only real example of this that we have in this area is going to be the frigid bumblebee. But even if you're in South Central Ontario, you're unlikely to find it. It's more northern. But if you're higher up north, um, I don't know, like Sudbury or even farther towards North Bay or Thunder Bay, you might be likely to encounter this bee. And we know, compared to the other species that had orange in the middle of the abdomen, this one has orange at the bottom of the abdomen. Again, it has that same band shape that is associated with the red-belted bumblebee. But again, orange is at the bottom of the abdomen and not in the middle where we would see it on a red-belted bumblebee. Now, quickly, our yellow grouping only has two different representatives in it, the northern amber bumblebee and the yellow bumblebee. They are quite similar in that their abdomens are extensively yellow. Northern amber mostly, it's pretty common for the northern amber to have T1 through T5 be yellow. Sometimes it could be T1 through T4 yellow. Similar, the yellow bumblebee commonly has T1 to T4 yellow. Very similar in that aspect. However, there are two traits that I use to differentiate these species, and they are reversed for each other. So, what do I mean by this? I'll just lay it out pretty plainly. The northern amber bumblebee, we see in the diagrams and in the photos, um, that it has yellow hairs on the face and the top of the head, whereas the yellow bumblebee has black hairs on the face and top of the head. So I'm looking at these right-hand pictures. Also, the northern amber bumblebee, we're going to look at the thorax now. It has a band between the wings. So does the yellow bumblebee, although the band is oftentimes much thinner. What's more important, though, on the thorax is under the wings. So the northern amber bumblebee will have black hairs under the wings compared to the yellow bumblebee, which will have yellow hairs under the wings on the thorax. So again, northern amber bumblebee, yellow hairs on the face and top of the head, but black under their wings. So black, you can think of it like their armpit, if a wing had an armpit. So again, yellow on the top of the head and yellow on the face, black hairs under the wings. The opposite is true for the yellow bumblebee. So black hairs on the face, black hairs on the top of the head, but yellow hairs under the wings. So again, although these species still found within the same, they have overlapping ranges, can be found in the same locations. They can look pretty similar, but again, these two traits reversed are how we would differentiate themselves. I will also note the northern amber bumblebee. If you're out observing bees, you'll also and you find this one if you're lucky to find it, or see photos of it, you'll note that it has a very, well, as the name suggests, amber shade of yellow. Looks quite regal to me. So the northern amber bumblebee having a different shade of yellow compared to other bumblebees as well can help you with species ID. But if we're looking at color patterns alone, again, it'll be the differences on the face and top of head, and the differences under the wings. This leads us to our yellow banded groupings. So we have three different representatives in this grouping here. I'll start with the black and gold bumblebee and the American bumblebee. The reason I'm starting with these ones in particular is that they are both quite similar in their size. So they're both very, very large, and they both have very, very dark wings. Whereas the yellow-banded bumblebee is considerably smaller, and their wings are not black, as we see in these photographs of the black and gold and American bumblebee. So I'll start with the black and gold and American and differentiate those, as they are the most similar of our yellow-banded species here. So the black and gold bumblebee, we see it has the thorax mostly black, though it has yellow at the top of the thorax. It also has two yellow bands at T2 and T3 with black on either side. This is also similar to the American bumblebee. However, the American bumblebee, we see in the diagram and on these photos that the abdomen, the first segment of the abdomen, T1, has a sort of horizontal divider running through it. The top half of T1 is black, and the bottom half of T1 is yellow. I don't know if you could see that from the diagrams there and the photographs, but again, the top half of T1 is black, bottom half of T1 is yellow, and that leads into the yellow T2 and T3. The black and gold bumblebee does not have that horizontal line running through T1. An added detail is that the black and gold bumblebee can have some extra yellow on the fringes, the lower fringes of T1, but it won't be that straight line across that we would see in an American bumblebee. Another distinction between the black and gold bumblebee and the American bumblebee is that the black and gold bumblebee has these little yellow eyebrows. You can see in that right-hand photo, top of the head, it has these yellow hairs, kind of drawing a really convincing eyebrow on this bee. That is not seen in the American bumblebee. So, if you're looking at what might be an American or a black and gold bumblebee, if you look at the face and you see eyebrows, you could tell pretty reasonably that it is a black and gold bumblebee. The yellow-banded bumblebee, um, similar to the black and gold bumblebee, has two yellow bands on T2 and T3. However, we also see that it has oftentimes a skirt of yellow at the bottom of T5, and that's shown in the diagram, and then also in this middle photo here. And it's lacking those eyebrows that we see in the black and gold. So, if you weren't able to tell size, and you're just looking at a photograph, and you're thinking this might be a black and gold bumblebee, this might be a yellow-banded bumblebee, you'd be able to tell by looking at the face again, the presence of those eyebrows for a black and gold bumblebee, or if you're looking at the abdomen, um, the presence of that skirt for the yellow-banded. Um, all right, so that leads us into our final grouping of bumblebees, which are cuckoo bumblebees. The most common of which that we'll see in South Central Ontario is the lemon cuckoo bumblebee. So, um, before we get into the traits of this specific species, I do want to preface this with a little bit more, just more broadly focusing on this, the hind leg here between regular female bumblebees and cuckoo female bumblebees. So, again, when you observe a regular female bumblebee's leg, it looks similar to what we've seen um, throughout the series. We see that triangular shape reaching out behind the leg. It's got a bit of a concave structure. Um, with the absence of pollen, we see it's the pollen basket itself is hairless and kind of reflective, indicating the presence of the corbicula or the pollen basket. And then conversely, when we look at the hind leg of a cuckoo female bumblebee, it looks more like what we would expect a male bumblebee's leg to look like. So um, it's missing that triangular shape. It's missing that reflective sheen, and instead it's just kind of rounded and hairy. So if you imagine you've gone out and observed a bumblebee and you've ruled it to be some kind of cuckoo because you look at the leg and you think there's no pollen basket there, and then you count the abdomen and you count 6 abdominal segments, 6 being indicative of a female, 7 being indicative of a male. So you look at the leg, you rule there to be no pollen basket, you count 6 abdominal segments, so you know it's a female, and that leads you to believe that this individual that I'm observing is a cuckoo female bumblebee. Again, the most common that we'd see in South Central Ontario is going to be the lemon cuckoo. What differentiates this one from most other cuckoo females is that it, again, like the perplexing or the confusing bumblebee, it lacks a thorax pattern. So it has an all yellow thorax. It does not have any spot or bands between the wings. It will always be yellow all around. The abdomen can be a little bit variable. Sometimes it can be entirely black. Most commonly, there's yellow on T3 and sometimes lightly on T1. But again, the standout trait of this specific cuckoo species is that the thorax will not have any pattern. It will just be all yellow hairs. The Ashton cuckoo is unlikely to be found, especially here in Ontario. It hasn't been observed in Ontario since 2008. There are still some recent records elsewhere in Canada, but if you're in the same area as I, odds are we won't be seeing the Ashton cuckoo, but they can be identified by the presence of a white band or a partial white band on T4. You might also encounter the Fernald's cuckoo. It looks similar to the indiscriminate cuckoo, except we can see from the diagrams of the head here that the fur-nosed cuckoo will have black hairs on the face, whereas the indiscriminate cuckoo will have yellow hairs on the face. Other than that, the thorax and abdomen are quite variable in these two species, so that would be the key differentiator to tell them apart. Um, Suckley's cuckoo and the indiscriminate cuckoo are a little bit more north, so they might not be readily found depending on where you are, at least if you're in the same area as me. But again, if you are in the same area as me here in South Central Ontario, the most common that you'd encounter is the lemon cuckoo. And if you're curious as to why or like what makes certain cuckoo bumblebees more or less common, I think I touched on this previously, but um, cuckoo bumblebees are tied to the population health of their host species. So lemon cuckoos, um, their host species are pretty common as far as our bumblebees go. For example, the two-spotted bumblebee is a very common species. That is a species that the lemon cuckoo will is hosting. The Ashton cuckoo, for example, being an endangered bumblebee, one of its primary hosts is the rusty-patched bumblebee, which is another very endangered bumblebee. So you can imagine declines in the rusty-patched would lead to declines in the Ashton cuckoo. And so that like the health of their host species would be tied to the health of their own population. So that would be why certain species are more common than others. And I'll just reiterate too, lemon cuckoos being most common cuckoo in South Central Ontario, where there's lots of human disturbance and urbanization and whatnot. The common species that host the lemon cuckoo have been very resilient to urbanization and landscape changes. So things like, again, the two-spotted or the common eastern, they've responded quite well to urbanization. You would then imagine that lemon cuckoos would still be thriving in this area because their host species are doing well. Now, I want to get into some species identification practice to wrap this up, and just to review the overall um, logic that we use to achieve this. Again, I'm going to use species that are found in South Central Ontario, but you can use this same process with other species in other ecoregions. So, for example, if you're elsewhere and you observe a bumblebee, you can still do the same process of placing them into a broader color group, such as a black bottoms bumblebee or a yellow banded, orange bottomed, what have you. And then from that color group, you can then compare between the species in that group to narrow down an ID based on the features that you see on the head, the thorax, which is again that middle part of the body where the wings and the legs attach, and the abdomen, which are broken up into 6 segments for females and 7 segments for males. So with that said, I have a few examples here. The first one here, we see this bee is mostly yellow, so right ahead we can place this in the yellow grouping. And I hope if you're watching at home, you've got your ID resources open, possibly the WPC ID cards on our website, and you're practicing along with me. But again, we can see that this is mostly yellow. We can place it in our yellow grouping. And there's only 2 representatives of species in this yellow grouping. It'll be either the northern amber bumblebee or the yellow bumblebee. And if you recall from our ID series, these species can be differentiated based on the traits on 2 key parts of their bodies. So what's on the face and the head, and what's on the thorax under the wings. And we know that this is a northern amber bumblebee because the northern amber has yellow on the face and top of the head, but black under the wings. The opposite is true for the yellow bumblebee. So if this were a yellow bumblebee, these would be swapped. We would see black on the face and top of the head and yellow under the wings on the thorax. This next example here, we could tell right away that it's an orange banded species based on what we're seeing on the abdomen. So we can go ahead and place it in that grouping. And then from there, we see a thumbtack kind of T-shaped pattern on the thorax. There's a band between the wings and a drop, like teardrop, coming down and touching the bottom of the thorax. We also see the abdomen follows the pattern of yellow on T1, orange on T2 and T3, and then yellow again on T4. Now we can rule out the red-belted bumblebee because it's lacking that yellow crescent on T2. And that really leaves us with mostly one possibility. It could possibly be the black-tailed bumblebee. However, we know the black-tailed bumblebee, the band on the thorax does not drop down quite as far. And we also know that the yellow band on T4 is often incomplete. And we know that the black-tailed bumblebee has a lot of black hairs on the top part of the thorax, where we're seeing a bunch of yellow hairs. So, especially because of the abdominal pattern and the teardrop shape on the thorax, we can rule this to be a tricolored bumblebee. This next one might be a little tricky. We can, from the side here, see that it appears to have an abdomen that starts yellow. It looks like T1 and T2 are yellow, and then after that is black. So we can go ahead and slot this into our black bottoms bumblebee grouping. Again, we see that T1 and T2 are yellow. We can then rule out the common eastern, which would only have T1 be yellow. We could also rule out the two-spotted, which would have an incomplete T2 yellow. It would just have those two spots of yellow in the middle of T2. And we can also rule out the brown-belted bumblebee because it's lacking that crescent on T2. Again, instead, it has a full band of yellow. For the same reason, it wouldn't be a red-belted bumblebee because a red-belted bumblebee, even if it were exhibiting a black morph of red-belted, it would still have that yellow crescent on T2, whereas again, we're seeing that full band of yellow on T2. So that leaves us with really two possible options. There are two species in the black bottoms grouping that have T1 and T2 yellow that might be mixed up with one another, those being the confusing bumblebee and the half-black bumblebee. So we'll look to the thorax to settle this. And we see the thorax here doesn't really seem to have a pattern. The top of the thorax there might look a little dark, but there's not actually any black hairs poking through those yellow hairs. And because of that alone, we would we would identify this individual as a confusing bumblebee. If it were a half black bumblebee, we would see a definitive black spot between the wings with black hairs poking in different directions. And here we see that there's just only yellow hairs here. The thorax is entirely yellow, leading it to be believed to be a confusing bumblebee. So this individual here, we see the abdomen has orange bands, so we can slot it into our orange banded grouping and work from that. A couple examples ago, we saw the tricolored bumblebee, so we have that fresh in our mind. It's hard to see what's on the thorax of this individual. So there seems to be possibly a spot there, maybe a band, but we'll rely on the abdomen for this ID because that is what is more clearly in front of us. And again, thinking back to the tricolored we saw not that long ago, that tricolored defined by T1 being yellow and then T2 and 3 being orange, we see here T2 is partly orange, but only on the bottom. And instead, it seems that it has a crescent of yellow on T2. Now, because of that crescent of yellow on T2, that bleeds into orange on T2. If you recall, that was a defining feature of the red-belted bumblebee. So again, because of this crescent of yellow on T2 followed by the orange, we can identify this as a red-belted. This individual is a little bit more, is a little bit easier of an ID. We see, again, it's a black bottoms individual, and it seems like only T1 has yellow. And that would really only leave one possibility, the common eastern bumblebee. We see the thorax has kind of a possible black spot, almost like a keyhole shape, dipping down towards the bottom of the thorax for some added confidence. But again, every other species in our black bottoms grouping, at least in South Central Ontario, will have something going on T2. Here again, T1 is yellow, and then T2 through 6 is all black. That would indicate a common eastern bumblebee. This individual here, we see yellow bands on the abdomen, so we can slot that into our yellow banded grouping. There are 3 different species that it can be after we've narrowed it down to our yellow banded grouping. Again, it seems like the abdomen here starts off black on T1, T2 and 3 is yellow, and then T4 and 5 is black. And we also see some fringe of yellow hairs, a little skirt of yellow hairs on the bottom of T5. It's hard to tell what's going on entirely on T1. So hard to tell if it's got that horizontal division on T1 that we would see on an American bumblebee. And it's also, we can't see what's going on the face. So we can't really use that to help us rule out the black and gold bumblebee, which would have those eyebrows um, on their face. However, the presence of that skirt on the bottom of T5 is all we really need to know that this is a yellow-banded bumblebee, because the other yellow-banded species, again being the American bumblebee and the black and gold bumblebee, will not have this yellow skirt on the bottom of T5. So its presence here immediately tells us that this individual is a yellow-banded bumblebee. I've got a couple more here. This one, again, is going to be fitting into our black-bottomed grouping. We see the abdomen here has a full T1 of yellow, and then T2, we see what seems to be two yellow spots in the center, forming a W shape. If we recall, that is very characteristic of two-spotted bumblebees. If we wanted added confidence, we can note the black spot between the wings. However, just based on the abdomen alone, those two spots would indicate a two-spotted. If it were a brown-belted bumblebee, for example, this a yellow on T2 would be forming a crescent that's reaching out all the way to the edge of the abdomen. However, these spots are restricted to the center of the abdomen, again indicating that this is a two-spotted. Now I've got one more. This individual here, again fitting into our black bottom grouping. And I want to focus again on the abdomen. So we see T1 is yellow, T2, the bottom is yellow, but there seems to be a brown spot in the middle there on T2. This brown spot is characteristic of the rusty patch bumblebee. So because of this, we can identify this individual as the rusty patch bumblebee. Well, thank you all for watching our series here on bumblebees and the work we do with them at Wildlife Preservation Canada. I hope you all learned something interesting and had some fun out of it. Again, please check out bumblebeewatch.org. If you're out and about and seeing some interesting bees, consider contributing to that platform and adding to this growing citizen science database that helps experts help bumblebees. So once again, my name is Cole Blair. I'm the lead biologist with Wildlife Preservation Canada's Native Pollinator Initiative, and I just wanted to extend a sincere thank you to everybody who has participated in this video series, and I hope to see your submissions on Bumblebee Watch. Thank you.